to counter the emerging terrorist threat?
First, let me just comment on the developments in West Africa. Post-colonial West Africa, France maintained quite a close relationship with its colonies or previous colonies. UK has been a bit more detached and left its colonies to fend for themselves. It is a pushback against that stronghold, in respect of them wanting to manage their own affairs. Africa's demographic is changing. There's a young and growing population that is exposed and enlightened, knows what's happening in the world, and are not prepared to be tied to anybody's apron strings. I mean, our young people are tired of living on the richest continent that has the poorest countries, and they believe that with the kind of resources Africa has, it should be able to leverage itself and create a better life for its people. Be that as it may, the countries in Africa have not grown at the pace that keeps up with the changing demographic. It was estimated that to be able to provide enough jobs and provide sustainable living for Africa's population, Africa needed to grow at 8% and above consistently for the next 15 to 20 years. Unfortunately, growth has been sluggish. I mean, sometimes in some countries when they've picked up, there was a time when Ghana was the fastest growing. We got 14% GDP growth. But then there comes a world economic crisis or a shock, and then things, go back and you have to start all over again. And so we've not been consistent in terms of creating opportunities for young people. And once that happens, then it means that people who have, some adverse feelings towards the state, if they feel that the state does not exist for them, become easy recruits to, ideological insurgencies and terrorism and others. So yes, the threat is mainly Islamic. There are different groups, Al-Qaeda, ISWAP, and all the other groups that are taking advantage of what the situation currently is. It started in Mali, northern Mali, and it was an agitation by the Tuareg people mainly because they thought they felt marginalized. But since then, other groups have infiltrated and spread broadly across the Sahelian belt. And so it's a threat not only to the Sahel, but there's always the fear that it might spread downwards to the coastal states.
So how would you address the specific problem relating to the youth and the appeal to the youth that you mentioned there?
I do think that we must do the things that make our economies create more opportunities for young people. And to do that, we must begin to think outside the box. I mean, we've practiced this model for how many years and it's not working. And so something must give. Africa must make more from its natural resources to create a better life for its people. And so one of the things would be to see how we're just not extracting and exporting, but that we're adding value to those things, creating jobs internally. I mean, since gone to Gaggisberg, we've exported raw cocoa beans. Why are we not producing the butter? Why are we not producing the chocolates? We've been exporting raw gold. Others are refining it. And they say because you don't have an LBMI certification, you cannot refine gold unless you have that certification. That certification comes from elsewhere that does not produce gold. We must act in concert to change the structure of the world's economic relations in order that Africa can have a fair chance to be able to create, opportunities for its population.
Parcelelo.
Okay, yeah. I was going to go right on to the a follow-up question about whether ECOWAS could have done things better in handling the coups in the Sahelian coups. Because I'm interested, Mr. President, in taking you up on what you're saying about the kind of youth productivity and employment crisis, and these young putschists coming into power with kind of Sankara-esque idealism, and what you think of that, and then you have, you know, ECOWAS on the other hand, with you know, profile of leaders, let us say, of a certain age, basically completely shutting the door on these coup leaders. Could ECOWAS have done things differently?
No, I think that what ECOWAS did was just to apply the rules in the book. But remember that those rules were formulated years ago. That, I mean, if there was a coup d'etat, this is what you had to do. You had to expel the country, you know, place sanctions on the country, and so on and so forth. But we need to look at those rules again and note it, and also note that these coup d'etats that are happening are the result of a loss of faith of our young people in our democratic experiments. Our young people are tired of corruption, they're tired of the poverty, they're tired of poor infrastructure, and they believe that the democracy is not delivering the dividend for them that is required. And so that's why, you know, there's this pushback. And so we need, as ECOWAS, to sit again and look at those rules that were set, that you sanction countries, you expel them from the union and all that, and come out with new rules of engagement. I do think that as a sub-region, we're not cooperating enough. We have all the ETLS and all the rules. ECOWAS trade liberalization says that if you have 60% local content, you can export goods freely into the neighboring country. It hasn't really worked that way. You know, you have all kinds of, you know, non-tariff barriers. You have transit fees charged by countries when they shouldn't. And so we're not leveraging the opportunities that this sub-regional cooperation should. And as long as we're not doing that, then we're not creating the momentum that can change people's lives. Every country is a silo in itself. And so I do think that we need to look at the whole ECOWAS project again. ECOWAS has been in existence since 1975. Indeed, it's the oldest, you know, sub-regional cooperation bloc. And it was formed before the EU. But I think that the EU has gone far more in advance of ECOWAS in terms of really integrating our people. And so we need to sit and have second thoughts about the whole ECOWAS project and see how we can make it work, especially for the young people of West Africa. But happily, the sanctions have been lifted. I think that creates the beginning, a platform for some rapprochement to be able to take place.
Yes, well, I'm glad you raised the question of economies, which obviously raises the important point of the cycle, or when the cycle Africa is. We've seen financial collapse of 2008, people suggesting that the economic cycles are getting shorter and shorter between boom and bust. The suggestion is that Africa may either be on the verge of a renaissance, depending on who you speak to, or indeed on the verge of a depression. It's a very variable picture. Even as people are enthusing about the potential of the AFCFTA to create that kind of internal knitted market that you're talking about and reboost economies. I wondered if you would describe yourself and your approach to the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, as Nkrumahist, and what your thoughts are of its potential for transforming the continent's economies.
I think that we've all come to the realization that Nkrumah's call for African unity was justified. And he had advocated that we should unite quickly before we get used to living in our independent states with our own flags and national anthems. Unfortunately, he did not win the argument, and we are 54 countries. And so a time came when we said, okay, we lost that moment. There's no way we're just going to suddenly integrate 54 countries in a flashbang. And so Happily, we have 5 sub-regional groupings on the continent. And so the decision was taken at the time that, okay, why don't we go ahead and consolidate the sub-regional groupings? And when we have done that, we open up, trade between the sub-regional blocks and use that as a building blocks to eventual continental unity. I was the chairman of the high-level committee on trade that was the precursor to the African Continental Free Trade Area. There are 2 stumbling blocks to the success of African Continental Free Trade. And the first one is just even the availability of the infrastructure for trade. All the trade routes, shipping routes, are not geared towards trade between Africa. They're geared towards trade with the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And so they're geared towards taking raw materials out of Africa and bringing finished commodities back in. And so if you wanted to ship tea from Kenya, you were more likely to have that that tea being transshipped from some other continent before coming back to Africa. And if I wanted to send, let's assume we were exporting cocoa products to, say, Sudan, the products will probably go to Europe somewhere, be transshipped through Dubai and somewhere to Sudan. So the infrastructure itself does not exist for that kind of trade. And so one of the things we must look at is how do we improve the trade infrastructure in Africa in terms of railways, in terms of road transport, in terms of direct shipping. Even if I wanted to ship a container from Accra to Monrovia, which is in West Africa, and I ship the container from Accra to London, that container is going to get to London before the other container gets to Monrovia. So those are the structural rigidities that we have. The next is that we have contained our production in silos for so long that even gearing up productivity to be able to get the goods to export to each other, we do not have it. In Ghana, our manufacturers have been producing for a 30 million market for years. And so how to leverage that production to a 1.3 billion market does not take place overnight. And so changing the orientation of our manufacturers to know that it's okay to ramp up production, put in new production lines, find new markets in the rest of the continent is something that we have to do. And that's why I'm advocating a 24-hour economic policy, asking our manufacturers to put in additional shifts, increase production. We have a pharmaceutical industry in Ghana that has been producing mainly for the Ghanaian market. I made some investment there. I gave them 50 million cedis at the time, which was about $10 million to expand their production so that they could export into the ECOWAS trade area, because at the time we were signed up to ETLS, but not to African Continental Free Trade. So some of them ventured into Sierra Leone, Liberia, into Burkina Faso. And so you still find Ghanaian pharmaceuticals in those countries. Mm. But how do we ramp it up to not a 300 million market, which is the ECOWAS market, but to a 1.3 billion continental market? Those are some of the things that we as a continent must resolve.
Do you think the political will and business will and interest are there to ramp up the production?
I do think they are there. It's a few infant steps at a time, but I think it will pick up as we solve the rigidities. For instance, we are looking to raise money to build the Abidjan-Lagos highway. I mean, if you look at West Africa, the biggest trade volumes are in that corridor between Lagos and Abidjan. And yet there is no highway that allows seamless movement of goods across that corridor. And so when I was president, we signed the MOU for the Abidjan-Lagos corridor. And I think it's gotten to a stage where they're ready to go on the market for funding to build that corridor. If they do it, and we reduce the snap checks and all the police barriers and all the impediments in that way, and that a truck can move seamlessly from Lagos to Abidjan to deliver goods. I think that that will be the beginning of something. I know that in East Africa too, some investment in the rail is taking place in Tanzania and things to open up landlocked countries to the ports. So we're beginning to see a movement. Something is beginning to happen. And like I said, these are infant steps, but if they pick up, I'm sure that things will change on the continent.
Marcelelo.
Mr. President, can we go back to the democracy question? You've been an incumbent, an election observer, and now an opposition presidential candidate. What are your thoughts on how electoral commissions should be designed to minimize partisan bias?
I've participated in many elections in Ghana as a participant, a direct participant, but also as an observer in many other elections all across the continent. And for one, you need an independent electoral commission. And in most countries, in the reports that I've written as an observer, is that the nations should have electoral commissions that are independent and autonomous and not under the control of any government. Now, what happens is you assume that the commission should be independent, but in many cases, it is not so. Let me use my country, Ghana, as an example. We've had an electoral commission that has been a model for the whole of Africa because of the innovations that we have introduced at every stage of the way. Anytime we've had an election, we look at what went well, what didn't go well, and then we make, reforms in order to improve the election. And because of that, it has created some of the best electoral processes that Africa has. Unfortunately, you get a government that comes in that appoints people who have a known partisan record, onto the commission. You'd as much as possible want to appoint people who are credible, who are respected, who everybody knows, would be neutral. But this is a government that has a record of appointing NPP people onto the Electoral Commission. And indeed, sometimes it's forced out of their own mouths. One of the commissioners, said that our party is the biggest existential threat to democracy in Ghana. And he's a member of the commission, and we know that he was a patron of the NPP, a student movement on campus and all that. There's even another one who was part of the manifesto writing committee of, the NPP. So when you have people like that being appointed onto the commission, then you begin to wonder, should we change the mode of appointment of these people? Should the appointment be taken away from the president and given to some other independent body and all that kind of thing? So these are things that are beginning to bubble up. And I think that Ghana has the shock absorbers to be able to go through these processes and make the necessary reforms. In the last election, we went to court because the Electoral Commission changed the results several times. The declared results were announced differently several times. And aside from that, there were some incidents that happened, after we had all signed off on the printing of ballot papers. Somebody just goes back, one of our agents, to a printing house, and millions of ballot papers have been printed. Those ballot papers ended up in unauthorized hands, and we know that a lot of ballot stuffing was done. Many of the places where they couldn't stuff the ballots and didn't want the evidence to remain, they went and chucked them away in some bush, and we found pre-printed ballot. People were arrested with ballot papers. We handed them over to the police. Today, there's been no prosecution. 8 people were gunned down in the election. It's a very complicated process, and it needs a lot of stakeholder engagement. It needs level-headedness, to be able to encourage the EC to do its work so that, we all are satisfied with the integrity of the election. Recently, there was an announcement of recruitment of returning officers. And the information we have is that ministers and DCs and others were asked to write the names of party apparatchiki and present them so that they would be appointed as the returning officers. Are these people going to be neutral? I mean, these are all questions that creates a problem for democracy in our countries.
No, Mr. President, since the return of multi-party rule, 1992 for Ghana, I believe, for Kenya as well, and several other countries on the continent. We seem to have been running around in circles on the issue of electoral integrity, creating independent institutions, and so on. Can we continue to say that this is merely a question of kind of slow-moving evolution of our own kind of democratic systems, or is there something else going on? Because across this continent now, the people are losing faith in elections. They know, they're very familiar with the Stalinist saying that it's not so much the vote that counts, but the people who count the votes. What's going on? You've been around the block.
Yeah, Pasalelo, I agree with you, and that accounts for part of the deterioration of the faith of our young people in our democracy. Because, I mean, they say, what is the essence of voting every 4 years when I don't see it creating any opportunities for me? And so we must not only vote, but we must consolidate our democracy, strengthen our institutions, improve our economies, and create opportunities for young people. Unfortunately, from time to time, you get a government and a leader who comes who takes things back. I mean, we've been trying to build up the institutions, the judiciary, and all the other state institutions, and then suddenly you come with a president who packs the courts with, people who have known party affiliations. Even though there's no cap or a ceiling on the number of Supreme Court judges, there comes a president who appoints the most judges in history. Just because you want to dominate the courts. We have problems with our judiciary's neutrality. There have been 2 interlocutory injunctions that were placed, one on the president and another on the speaker. And then suddenly the judiciary call for hearing of the interlocutory injunction against the speaker, when the interlocutory injunction against the president was filed first. And it leaves a sour taste in people's mouths. So I am for strengthening state institutions, and I believe that over the years from President Rawlings, even though President Rawlings came out of a military regime, he did well, especially considering the fact that he was the first president after the promulgation of the 1992 Constitution. He did well to start to build up those institutions. President Kufuor came, he's a known Democrat, and I don't think that there were those tendencies. President Mills, who's an alumnus of this university, was a perfect Democrat. I came and I did my best. I never ever interfered with the judiciary in any way. I never interfered in the working of state institutions. But unfortunately, I can't say the same for the last 7.5 years.
You paint a troubling picture of democracy, and you refer to interlocutory injunctions and the process surrounding the anti-LGBTQI bill. Your comments on the impending passage of the bill and the politics around it?
It was a bill that was moved by private members. We call it a private members bill. And there were 4 members from the NDC side and 1 from the MPP side. So we can say it was a bipartisan bill. The bill has been in Parliament for quite a while, and eventually it was passed. Now we're faced with, when a sovereign parliament has passed a bill, can anybody say that bill should not pass? It's weighing our democracy, because the people's representatives have voted and it was unanimously passed. There was no objection. But it goes to the president, and the president says that the attorney general has advised that he shouldn't sign it because it places a charge on the state, and the rule says that a private member's bill must not place a charge on the state.
Article 108.
Yeah, but the constitution also says that after Parliament has finished the bill, it shall present the bill to the president for signature, for assent, and the president can assent, and it becomes law, it becomes an act. Or the president can dissent and return the bill within 7 days with stated reasons why he thinks that there's a problem with the bill. Or alternatively, he can refer it to the Council of State for advice. Now, what has created this situation is the president says, I won't sign it because some individual has gone to the Supreme Court to put an injunction on the president not to sign it. And I believe that that's not constitutional. The constitutional process must go through, because that is the absurdity that is happening. And so somebody also goes and sues the speaker and says that I have a problem with the process of approving these ministers, so you cannot pass them. And so if we left it for any individual to go to the court and pass an interlocutory injunction, and because of that, constitutional bodies are not carrying out their duties, we'll end up in absurdity, which is what we are in currently. And so there's an impasse between the two bodies, and we wait to see how it will be broken.
The suggestion by the likes of Martin Bibu is that the legal procedure is perfectly within order.
Yeah, he's a lawyer, well respected, but the point I'm making is, if we don't let the constitutional processes play out, then it's going to create a problem for our democracy. Because if any